It's really with a great deal of pleasure and some difficulty to introduce somebody as well known as Karl, but I'm going to do my best here. He's been called a lot of things over the years, the architect, the brain, the mastermind, and Karl, a lot of other things that I really can't discuss in mixed company. But, I've known Karl probably for more years than either one of us want to admit. So I can tell you for sure he's an all-around good guy, and he's really done a lot over the years for the conservative cause. And if you really want to know more about him, suggest you read his prior book, was it Courage and Consequence, which really is a great read about how a kid can grow up in Sparks, Nevada, and end up being a senior advisor to the President of the United States. And it's a really interesting read and tells his life story. Do we have any Capitol staffers here today? Good. Well, I want to tell y'all, you know where this guy got his start? In Texas, he started out working for Representative Fred Agnich. Fred was one of just a handful of Republicans in the Texas House at that time, and I think there was only one or two Republicans in the entire Senate. So quite a change in the dynamics in the Texas political scene since the time Karl came to Texas. So, and really over the years, Karl, through his company and his exploits, he's being a political consultant, has helped change that political dynamics to where now the Texas legislature is made up of supermajorities in both chambers. So in some part, Karl's played a role in that. He also worked for Governor Bill Clements, who was the first Republican governor since Reconstruction in the state of Texas. And in 1994, he decided to take on a very popular incumbent governor, Ann Richards, and help get George W. Bush elected the second Republican governor since Reconstruction in the state of Texas. And, taking on an incumbent is not easy. Ann Richards was very popular at that time, so he really did a good job in that race and moving forward. And as you know, he went on and to do a lot of other things. And Karl, I'm not going to tell them any stories about the fights we had in the governor's chambers between 1995 and 2000, but I would tell them one little deal. Back in 1999 in the session, we noticed all these Republican dignitaries from around the country visiting Austin, So they'd come in and visit with Governor Bush, and so it was all part of the strategy of the draft Bush movement, and this guy right here was the guy that was pulling the strings on that, and he probably won't admit it, but then he went on to win 2 presidential campaigns, really a really brilliant legal strategist, and like I said, played the role for years in helping us change the dynamics in the state of Texas. We've got Karl here today to talk to us about his newest book, The Triumph of William McKinley. You think politics today in 2016 is weird? You got to read his book, folks. Both William Jennings Bryan and McKinley were both running against the political establishment at the time. Well, we think that's weird this year. Well, this isn't the first time. And Karl, you've got to tell them about the Republican State Convention in 1894. I mean, some stories. So he's here to share some insights on his book with us this morning. And also, Karl, I hope while you've got the podium, you'll tell us, give us a little bit of your opinion on the 2016 election politics. So join with me in welcoming our special guest today, Karl Rove.
Thank you, Kent, for that long, rambling, and largely inaccurate introduction. He was right, though. I did get my start in Texas. I came to Texas as a young guy and went to work for the Republican National Committee man and the senior Republican in the House, Fred Agnich at Dallas. He was the first Republican elected from Dallas County, and this was back when they elected him county-wide in order to keep the Republicans from winning all those seats in North Dallas, they required that we win election countywide, and Fred was well-known enough and rich enough that he could do that, pulled it off, and was the first Republican from Dallas County. We had 13 Republicans in the House of Representatives, and Fred was the senior guy. And I spent my session in 1977 working on a critical piece of legislation which passed, which was a measure to unify and standardize the 259 county ordinances regarding the taking of bait fish from Texas waters. This landmark piece of legislation passed with my adept stewardship and worked behind the scenes on behalf of Representative Agnich's #1 priority. When he told me what he was going to spend the session working on, I said, "Why, Mr. Agnich, why in the hell are you going to do that?" Turned out he actually had an idea, which was if you could get the counties, which then set their own bait limits and also set their own game rules, if you could get them standardized on taking a bait fish by saying the botanist at the Department of Parks and Wildlife ought to decide it, you could then get the same rules, scientific rules, in place for the taking of wildlife. And sure enough, the following year, Texas began to modernize its rules regarding wildlife, and we set statewide, we set up the regions for dove, and we set up the limits for various kinds of animals. But Fred was a great conservationist and outdoorsman, and he had a secret idea about how he was going to go about affecting this monumental change in Texas conservation policies. And it was a stupid little law that had to do with bait fish. Anyway, I had a hell of a lot of fun. Delighted to be introduced by Kent, who was a great ally to then Governor Bush on education policy, and also delighted to be here with Arlene Wolgemuth, who was also a great friend of Governor Bush's and a friend of mine. And Arlene, you got to get professional counseling, though, before you move to California. Most of those Californians are moving here and to Texas, and here's a Texan we're going to lose to California, all because she's got grandchildren. So, Ken mentioned this book. Think about our politics today. Broken political system, political gridlock in Washington, high degree of economic anxiety being driven by a wave of disruption being spread through our economy by new inventions and by globalization, and a change in demography. Country seems to be changing right in front of our eyes. Well, you may think this is unusual, but it's not, because that's exactly the setting for 1896. In fact, worse. We think we got difficulties today. I want you to think for just a minute about the decade, the quarter of a century, the decades leading up to 1896. American political system was broken in a profound way. We had 5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody got 50% of the vote. The country was so deeply divided that we had 5 presidents elected with a minority of the vote. They got a plurality, but no majorities. During that time, we had 2 presidential elections in which somebody won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. And one of those involved a 5-month-long dispute about the Electoral College votes of Florida. We had another president who won the Electoral College and won a plurality of the popular vote nationwide, 7,000 votes. And we had divided government like we have today, only worse. We had, over this 24-year period, 2 years in which there was a Democrat president, Democrat House, Democrat Senate, and 2 years in which there was a Republican president, Republican House, and Republican Senate, and the rest of the 20 years was divided government, and it was divided government that was not only divided by the political ideologies of the parties. The 2 parties had deeply felt convictions about the course of the country. The Democratic Party was the party of states' rights, of low taxes, limited federal government, and for giving the South the right to deprive its white and black Republicans of the right to vote. The Republican Party was the party of a more robust federal government, high taxes through high tariffs, and voting protections for black and white Republicans in the South. And they felt strongly about these 2 different philosophies. But in addition to the 2 different philosophies, they were still fighting the Civil War. These were men who entered the Congress not only imbued with the sense of my party's philosophy, but also with their party's history. When the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 1874, first time since 1857 they'd been in the majority, it was called the Victory of the Brigadiers, because so many Confederate officers were elected to the United States Congress and enough to take control of the House. So they were still fighting a war in which 600,000 Americans died for 10 and 20 and 31 years after the Civil War. So you think politics today is ugly? I'm reading through the congressional record. The Republicans' success, the Democrats are in the majority in the House. An attempt to pass a free trade measure led by Roger Q. Mills of Texas, Democratic Ways and Means Committee chairman, and the Republicans block it by getting 40 Democrats from manufacturing and wool gathering states in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Midwest to break party ranks and oppose this free trade measure. And one of it's called, the former Speaker of the House, Samuel Randall from Pennsylvania, is the Democrat who leads this revolt, and they call it Randall and his 40 Thieves. And one of the Democrats gets up on the floor in the immediate aftermath of the loss of this vote and excoriates by name one of his Democratic colleagues and said, "I would not blank you if you were a dog." Now, you can fill in the blank. 4 letters. On the floor of the House of Representatives. And this exists for decades. This is not episodic. This exists for decades. The Republicans take control of the House in 1890. Back then they were civilized, so they didn't meet until the following fall. So in the fall of 1891, the House comes into session, and the Democrats announced they will not allow the consideration of a single bill. They will refuse to answer the roll call, and thereby deny the House of Representatives a quorum. And as a result, not a single, this is not, we're going to stop, we're going to shut down the government unless you repeal Obamacare. This is, we don't care. Nothing is going to be considered. After about 2 or 3 days of these fruitless efforts to gain a quorum call, the Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine, 6 foot 3 inches tall, acerbic, smart, brilliant, mean, tough, he's had enough. So at the end of this fruitless roll call, he says, "I direct the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, Mr. Grusendorf present, Mr. Talmadge Sheffield present." Every Democrat on the floor of the House, he calls them out by name and directs the clerk to call them present. And all hell breaks loose. A Democrat stands up and angrily says, "Under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present on the floor of the House without my permission." And Reed says, "The chair is merely stating the fact, as the honorable gentleman from Kentucky deny he's present on the floor of the House." This kicks off a 3-month-long battle over whether or not the Speaker of the House has the right to do this that ultimately ends up in the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And in the meantime, no business gets conducted as they angrily debate whether or not Czar Reed has the power to do this. And one of the opening days of the debate, a Texan plays a role. William Henry Howdy Martin of Athens, Texas. 6 foot 6 inches tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake, fought the entire Civil War with Hood's brigade, one tough hombre. He stands up, points his bony finger at Reed, and says, "If any member will order me to remove this dictator from his position upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith." Reed, who's really cool, says, "The honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order," and moves on. Howdy Martin is so pissed off, he starts showing up every day and taking a seat right in front of the Speaker of the House of Representatives so he can see him. Pulls out his 16-inch long Bowie knife and spends the day methodically sharpening it on his boot sole. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not remember Nancy Pelosi doing this in 2011 with her stilettos. This is how angry Congress is. And similarly, the economy is deeply troubled. We're in the midst of what turns out to be the greatest depression America had ever suffered to that date, only exceeded in history by the Great Depression. And even in the places of prosperity in the country, there's deep economic anxiety because you think the smartphone and the iPad and the internet are discombobulating. Think about an era in which we have the electric light bulb and electric engines and rail cars, electric street cars and refrigerated rail cars and a nationwide network of telegraphs and mechanical devices that seem routine and ordinary to us, but were deeply, deeply troubling. You had some artisan who made a tin plate by hand and sold it for $0.25, and now his competition is a machine that stamps them out with a uniformity and a regularity and a speed that no human being can keep track of. You had farmers who said, my goal is to grow enough to feed my family, and at the end of the year to have enough to sell a little bit at market and make a little bit of money in order to pay down the mortgage and maybe provide a few necessities for my family. And what happens? Now they have to start worrying about what's happening with the wheat crop in Ukraine, what's going to happen with the cotton crop in Egypt. We're a globalized international market, and the little farmer is competing on an international stage. So there's a level of anxiety that gives rise to the first real burst of populism in America, particularly in the Midwest and the South, where the crop lien system and mortgages, I mean, the absence of a modern financial system, it's only then emerging, but it's not the modern system that we know. So if you want to get a mortgage and you're a farmer, you can't go down to the local bank and get it. You have to get it from a specialized mortgage company that's generally backed by an Eastern insurance company headquartered on Wall Street. And in an era of essentially deflation, your interest rates are between 9 and 14%. So there's a reason why everybody's discombobulated. And then there's the cultural transformation of the country. We'd always been a nation of immigrants, always. But starting in 1870s, the immigration began coming from unusual places. Before then, it had come from the familiar places, mostly England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland and Germany. But starting in the 1870s, we began to see a significant change in the flow of immigrants, and they were coming from places like, we had Ukrainian wheat farmers and Bohemian beer makers and Polish farmers and Croatian miners and tanners from Spain and potters from Italy and Greek sponge fishermen. And suddenly America was no longer the white Anglo-Saxon country that it had been since almost its creation. And suddenly we had all these weird people coming from everywhere, and people were asking, is America really still America? The largest public interest group, the largest pressure group in America was the American Protective Association. In a country of less than 100 million people, it claimed 13 million members. And the American Protective Association stood for white Anglo-Saxon values and against popery, against Catholicism, and against immigration from Catholic countries. And 13 million Americans signed up to receive its voter guide and its publications, and it was the largest political force in America. So America back then, sort of like now. And as Kent said, we had two very unusual candidates emerge. On the Republican side, the front runner was Reed, and he was backed by the Republican bosses. And we did have bosses back then, men who ran gigantic machines fueled by patronage. The leader of the bosses they called themselves the Combine, and they wrote each other coded letters. And they were led by the Easy Boss, former Senator Thomas Collier Platt of New York. His able assistant was probably the most brilliant Republican strategist around, the Republican junior senator from Pennsylvania, Matthew S. Quay. And one of the more interesting ones is a particular favorite of mine, the most lethal opponent to William McKinley in his bid for the Republican nomination, the blonde boss, William J. Larimer, 34 years old. In 1884, at the age of 22, he voted and was disgusted with the quality of the organization in the Second Ward of Chicago. He showed up at the polling place, and back then you didn't have an official ballot. Your ballot was handed to you by a ballot peddler representing your party, stood outside the precinct, and when you showed up, you asked him for a Republican ballot, or you went to the Democratic polling worker and asked for a Democratic ballot. And there was no ballot peddler outside his precinct. So in retaliation, he organized a group of young men. He was a streetcar conductor. He organized a bunch of young men in the Second Ward of Chicago, and within 2 years had turned it from a Democratic stronghold to a Republican stronghold. And he's awarded with a seat at the age of 24 on the Cook County Republican Central Committee. 2 years later, at the age of 26, he's given a patronage job in the water department. 2 years after that, at the age of 28, he's the head of the water department with 1,300 patronage jobs under his command. And surprise, surprise, 2 years later, he's used those men and marshaled their support and has become the chairman of the Cook County Republican Central Committee, gotten himself elected to Congress, and is in control of 10,000 patronage workers. And at the age of 34, he's got his eye on a U.S. Senate seat and decides the way to get there is by throwing in with the other bosses and voting for Reed. And along comes McKinley, whom you do not know about. You may know he's the 25th president of the United States, but let me just tell you, you know nothing about the man. Nothing. I thought I knew something about the guy. And then I started to research in this book, and he's one of the most remarkable figures to appear on the American political scene. First of all, he is an astonishing war hero. It's April of 1861. Lincoln has called for 90-day volunteers to end the rebellion. And the men of the Poland militia, all of them teenagers, the Poland, Ohio militia, show up at Camp Jackson outside of Columbus, Ohio, and say, we're here for the 90-day enlistment. And they say, sorry, we filled the quota. Here's your choice. Enlist for 3 years or the duration, whichever is longer, or go home. And almost to a man, these 18 and 19-year-olds enlist in the United States Army, Private William McKinley among them. He ends the war 4 years later as a major, having received 3 battlefield promotions for unbelievable valor. He is recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor and discourages his comrades from pressing the application, saying, I was only doing my duty. He survived 2 suicide missions, one of which he chose for himself. He's a meticulous, well-organized person, so he's put in charge, and with great integrity, and he's put in charge of the supplies for the 23rd Ohio. So he's comfortably behind the front line on the bloodiest day of the Civil War, September 1862, Antietam. The 23rd Ohio goes into battle at 2 a.m. in the morning. And by 2 p.m. in the afternoon, they have fought their way across a 700 or 800-yard open field and across the famed Stone Bridge. Those of you who are Civil War buffs remember the picture of the rounded half-moon stone bridge. And they're comfortably now sheltered under a bluff, having suffered horrific casualties. And McKinley has watched this all from the comfort of the back lines. The supply train shows up. Worried about the fact that his men have had nothing to eat or drink since the previous night, McKinley decides he's going to resupply the 23rd. He commandeers a wagon, loads it with hardtack beef and big tins of coffee, and begins to make his way through a forested area towards the front. An officer comes upon him and says, what are you doing? He says, I'm going to resupply the 23rd Ohio. He says, no, you're not. Turn around. He said, you will have to cross an open field, and there's nothing in that field but dead men. McKinley says, well, I can't turn my wagon around here. I need to go forward to find a place. Officer says, fine, rides off. McKinley says to himself, forget it, I'm going. Another officer comes upon him, gives him the same order, has the same conversation, orders McKinley to turn around, and makes the mistake of riding off. So McKinley whips the horses and comes bursting out of the tree line to cross a 700-yard field raked by Confederate musket and cannon fire from a ridgeline. And the Confederates cannot believe what the hell they're seeing. Here's this idiot with a wagon rolling across their front line, and all hell breaks loose. A cannon shell blows off the back of the wagon. But somehow or another, McKinley makes it to the stone bridge and over it, and the eyewitness accounts are moving. I wish I could have been there. They say when McKinley comes roaring across the bridge, the men of the 23rd Ohio stand as one and cheer their comrade. He makes his way among the wounded, providing them cups of coffee from his giant tin can. One of them, grievously wounded, looks up at him and says, God bless you, lad. And McKinley later said it was the greatest compliment, the greatest reward he could have ever received. He's promoted. The sergeant is now made a second lieutenant. 2 years later, First Lieutenant McKinley is at the Battle of Kernstown. He's now become a very successful command officer and relied upon by his brigade commander, a colonel. And at the Battle of Kernstown, the Confederates burst out of the woods early in the morning and begin to crumple the Union line. And the 5 regiments under the command of this particular brigade commander, he orders them to retire while they still can in good order. And the order is received by 4 of the regiments, but one of them on the far right of the Union line, the 13th West Virginia, doesn't get the order. They're in an orchard, sheltered from the action. They can't see what's approaching. They're about ready to be cut off and shot to pieces. So the brigade commander, desperate, turns around and sees McKinley and orders him to ride to the 13th West Virginia and order him to retire. The Union line is moving back. And this means McKinley has to ride in front of the Union line, ever closer to the Confederates on an open battlefield to get to the 13th West Virginia. His tent mate says it was a suicide mission. McKinley mounts his horse and begins to ride across an open battlefield with cannons going off everywhere and musket fire on both sides. And somehow or another, he makes it through, despite the fact that at one point a shell goes off and his tent mate, General Russell Hastings, said, we thought he was gone. But he rode out of the gray cloud of smoke came the small brown horse with the erect horseman. McKinley somehow or another survives his suicide mission, makes it to the 13th West Virginia, orders him to withdraw in the nick of time. Literally, the commanding officer, startled, says to McKinley, at least let us give them a round. They form up the 13th West Virginia. They march out of the orchard. The Confederates are about ready to enter the orchard, thinking they've got them surprised, and are themselves surprised to see the 13th West Virginia march out and immediately pour around into them before they retire in good order. McKinley rides behind the Union lines, arrives back to the brigade commander's tent, walks into the brigade commander's tent. His brigade commander, Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, himself a future president, is completely taken aback. He says, "My God, I never expected to see you in this life again." This is a man that we don't know. He was an accomplished legislator. He was a remarkable figure who immediately at an early age, because he did his homework and prepared well and thought deeply and couched his message in a powerful way, became the Republicans' leading spokesman on the economic issues of the time. He became the protege of the Republican Ways and Means Committee chairman, William Pig Iron Kelly of Pennsylvania, who adopted him as his son, and he becomes an enormously effective legislator. One of the things I found out about the Gilded Age is that during this era, if your party lost control of the Congress and you had won re-election by a small number, no matter what happened, they tossed you out. We did it to them, they did it to us. It was routine. So in 1882, the Republicans lose control of the House, and McKinley, in his swing district in Ohio, wins re-election by 7 votes. And he's seated provisionally, but an election challenge is filed, and everybody knows what the outcome is going to be. The Democrats will toss him out, along with several others, incidentally. And they do. But when they do, something extraordinary happens. 7 senior Democrats, or actually 6 senior Democrats and 1 junior member, break party ranks and vote to retain McKinley. Among them, his greatest adversaries on the economic issue of the time, protectionism. Roger Q. Mills of Texas leads these Democrats to vote to retain McKinley, not because they agree with him, but because as an act of respect for his talent as a legislator, they say, we ought to keep him. And but he's kicked out. He knows he's going to be kicked out. And they know he's going to be gone too, but sometimes something's more important than party loyalty, and they do this as an act of respect. And he's beloved in Congress. Reed once complained, he said, "My opponents call me names, but they feel compelled to apologize to William before they call him names." And this is the kind of man that he was. And in 1896, we see a race for the presidency that involves these 2 improbable candidates. Actually, on the Republican side, they're at least candidates, and they have a long and bruising battle. On the Democratic side, there's not a battle over candidates. There's a battle over an idea. The silver men inside the Democratic Party blamed the gold policies of the incumbent Democratic president for the failure of the economy. And so what they do is they agree that they will not campaign for a specific candidate, but instead unite around having a silver plank in the Democratic platform, a plank calling for the free and unlimited coinage of silver, an inflationary currency, and that they will campaign to get the majority of the delegates necessary to do that, and then use that as leverage to get the right man nominated for president. But their argument is, let's not worry about a candidate, let's worry about an idea. So literally there is the Democratic front runner, Richard Park Bland, congressman from Missouri. For 20 years, he's led the fight for free silver in the United States Congress. He's the front runner, but he doesn't conduct a campaign, nor does his principal opponent, Horace Boyes, Uncle Horace, a Democrat turned Republican governor of Iowa, nor Pitchfork Ben Tillman. He doesn't declare himself as an official candidate for president, but he does travel the country encouraging a silver platform. Instead, they keep their focus upon repudiating the sitting Democrat president and pressing for a silver platform. And by doing so, they allow the emergence of a completely improbable candidate. William Jennings Bryan is not considered a serious candidate for the presidency 36 hours before he's nominated. The night before he gives his famous Cross of Gold speech, he's the leader of the Nebraska Silvermen. He's approached by the publisher of the Rocky Mountain News, who says to him, would the Nebraska delegation support this guy for president? And Bryan says, no, we're not going to do that. So to make conversation, Robert Patterson says of Bryan, well, who do you think is going to be the nominee? And Bryan says, I've got as good a chance as any. I've got Nebraska on the first ballot, and I've been promised half of the Oklahoma Territory on the second. And Patterson goes away thinking, I have just talked to a complete lunatic. On the next morning, sort of the David Broder of his time, Francis E. Lepp is sitting on the floor of the convention writing his column for the evening newspaper in the New York Herald, and sitting on either side of him are two seasoned political observers, one a Democrat, one another journalist, and they're looking over his shoulder, and he says the Democrats are looking for a Moses. And if the moment is right and Bryan gets them, he could be the coming man. And both of these guys say, you're nuts. He's not even a candidate. The Democrat says to him, I don't even know what he looks like. And Lepp points across the floor, 20,000 people sitting in the Coliseum, and he points to him and he says, he's a young man in the black alpaca coat sucking on a lemon. Bryan is about ready to give the Cross of Gold speech, which itself is the result of 7 accidents, the last one of which has just occurred, any one of which, those 7 accidents, if they'd gone the other way, Bryan would not have been there, able to give the speech, and literally stampede the convention with a 30-minute talk. And the Republicans are behind the 8 ball when this occurs. When Bryan is nominated, the country is galvanized by the youngest man ever nominated for president, 36 years old. And he becomes an immediate star, and the Democratic Party and its policy of free silver immediately leaps to the front. They didn't do polls back then. They conducted canvasses. So in late July, every Republican precinct chairman in every battleground state had to conduct a canvass of every voter in their precinct, report it to the county chairman, report it to the state chairman, and the Republicans are suffering severe defections over the silver issue. They're losing 25% of their supporters in Iowa, which would make for a massive defeat in a strong Republican state. And the reason is because of Bryan and his free silver message. Now, it's sort of hard for us to understand what free silver means and why people felt so passionately. There's nearly 90% turnout in the North. And it's sort of hard for us to figure out what that means. But I'm going to read you 3 sentences from the Cross of Gold speech, and tell me if you see that this might have some relevancy today. At the heart of the battle over gold versus silver is this theory, says Bryan. There are 2 ideas of government. Republicans believe if you just legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, then their prosperity will leak through on those below. Democrats believe if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, then their prosperity will find its way up and through every class that rests upon it. Trickle-down economics at the heart of the 1896 campaign. And McKinley goes on to win, not because he's doing everything right. He makes lots of errors and stumbles, but because he finally finds the message about how to sell conservative economics to the working class man. How do you talk about economics in a way that causes somebody who works with their hands for a living in a smelter or a factory or a refinery or a mine to say, my cause is better served by joining with the conservative, not the radical. By going with the man who talks about shared prosperity, how capital and labor will neither be prosperous without the other being prosperous, as opposed to the man who says we must stick it to the money power and overthrow the leeches of Wall Street. And it's a remarkable story. And it's not a straight line. It is a reminder that nothing in politics is ever foreordained, but the decisions of human beings making mistakes, doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, stumbling their way along. I mean, you think this is just sort of like amorphous forces working their way through American politics? This book has got sex, violence, backstabbing, betrayal, and really cool nicknames. Everybody had a cool nickname. The Napoleon of Protection, the Boy Orator, the Platte. My personal favorite, Richard Park Bland, who's led this fight for free silver, his nickname is Silver Dick. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. Can't mention one incident. This is amazing. I mean, this is not polite politics. This is not, sort of, let's all meet in the nice theater at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and talk about something. Next door, literally next door, the Republican State Convention comes in 1896 in the building that stands right next door to this, just to the west, just to the east of us on 9th Street. It was then the Opera House, the Millet Opera House, and 900 Republicans gather. They're led by the Republican National Committee man. He's been the committee man for nearly 2 decades. Crocker's forebear. He is the wealthy, well-educated, well-spoken African-American Norris Wright Cuny of Galveston. And he's a member of the Combine, the Republican bad guys. And they meet on Sunday night, and they're very concerned because most of the delegates who are showing up are clearly McKinley men. And the Combine men cannot agree upon what they're going to do. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, Sunday night, Monday morning, Cuny's had enough of it, and he says, I'm in charge, I'm going to make the decision. And he declares a race war. He goes to every black delegate and says, I don't care who you are for president. Be for anyone you want to be. But they're trying to keep the black man down. They're running a Jew from Houston for temporary chairman of the convention because they don't want a black man to be seen in charge of our party. I'm going to run against Judge Rosenthal, and I want your support no matter who you're for. And all the blacks get together and say, that sounds good. And the next morning, they hold the election for the temporary chairman. Rosenthal is getting beaten so badly in the race for temporary chairman that he says, I want to withdraw. And one black delegate stands up and says, we don't want him to withdraw, we want to beat him. And they do, electing Norris Wright Cuny temporary chairman. He appoints Bill Gooseneck McDonald of Forney, a black fraternal leader and teacher, as the Credentials Committee chairman, and they proceed to toss out the 7 largest delegations to the state convention that are dominated by McKinley men. The Travis County delegation is told, you men only get a half a vote each. The entire Bexar County and Dallas County delegations are tossed out in toto by the Credentials Committee so they can run in fake delegates. They get free railroad passes from the compliant railroad owners and bring in Combine men to take the place of the duly elected delegates to the state convention. And they've tossed out 200 delegates, but they haven't tossed out enough. So when they begin to meet on Wednesday morning, Cuny realizes he still has a minority. He can't call a single roll call vote because if he is, the McKinley men will beat him. So everything is on a voice vote. And when they get ready to vote for the state delegates to the national convention, and he declares the Combine men have won, when clearly there is a majority of McKinley men in the room, a riot breaks out. 500 men storm the stage, led, as the Associated Press says, by a burly mountain of a Negro. Let me find it here, you'll love this. The hall exploded. The McKinley men stormed the stage, aiming to push Cuny aside and install Webb Flanagan, the GOP's 1890 gubernatorial candidate, in his place. One burly Negro came plowing through the jam, an Associated Press reporter wrote, pushing men in front of him as if they were so much chaff. Behind him was a determined, fast-moving, angry mob of 500 McKinley men. Cuny expected the assault. His people were prepared to defend the podium and him. Quote, the first Negro to reach the stand made a lunge at Cuny's head with a fist, an eyewitness wrote, but little Bill Ellis, Cuny's longtime right-hand man, moved faster, pulling his revolver and shoving it in the assailant's face. Quote, the two men eyed each other for about 10 seconds, then grappled and went down with, quote, the howling mob swaying about and around them. A large table on the stage had collapsed under the combatants. Delegates grabbed broken pieces as weapons. Chairs and other tables were smashed over heads or against bodies. Fists, bludgeons, bottles, knives, and razors appeared. Other pistols were drawn, but luckily not used. The fight went on for 20 minutes before the city marshal and a squad of officers arrived and began indiscriminately clubbing delegates. At the Republican National Convention, of the 900 delegates to the Republican National Convention, 223 of them are challenged in credentials, starting with the 30 men from Texas. You may think this is sort of an antiseptic story of sort of amorphous forces working their way through our culture and politics, but it's one hell of a read dreamed up by somebody who sounds like a coked up Hollywood screenwriter. Anyway, with that, I'd answer and duck your questions. Yeah, go ahead. Raise your hand. If not, we're done. Fritz.
Years ago, and this is sad that I confess this, but I want to say it was eight or 10 years ago, watching C-SPAN, you were being interviewed about your interest. Thank you, ma'am. Oh, thank you. About the past as prologue story. When, in your mind, was the seed planted that you had an interesting story that would be captivating enough for public consumption? Are we going back decades? Or?
Well, this is sort of a weird story how I stumbled onto this. I was teaching at the LBJ school, the only Republican member of the faculty, showing that God does have a good sense of humor. And I was teaching an undergraduate course in a joint appointment with the School of Government and the School of Journalism. And the head of the government department then was Jim Fishkin, and he was a buddy of mine. He's now out at Stanford. He's the head of the department at Stanford. And he said, Karl, he said, look, here's the deal. We'll put you in the PhD program and fast track you to your PhD. Only one problem. You're 44 and you need to get your BA. So I took the freshman astronomy course in the summer, and I took the math course by exam. But I was running a public affairs company, and there was no evidence I could string two sentences together, so I had to fulfill the upper division writing requirement. And this was 1976, I think it was, 1996, excuse me. So Bush was a little thinking about the future, and things were sort of bubbling, and I didn't have much time. I had a business and a family. So I checked the catalog, and in the catalog was history, I think it was 870-something. Seminar and historical source writing. All you had to do was get a professor to take you on, do the research in the original material, and write a paper and get 3 hours and fulfill the requirement. Now, it sounded great, but I had no idea it was never done. It was in the catalog, but literally nobody ever did this. So I walk in the history department and I say, great serendipitous moment. I walk in and I say to the woman behind the counter, I want to do this. She's like, oh yeah, right, that's never going to happen. I said, well, how do I go about doing this? She says, well, you got to get a professor to take you on. I said, well, who's here? She said, one. One professor's here, Lewis L. Gould. I had no idea who he was. So I walk in and I say, I'd like to take this history course. And he like, yeah, sure, like that ever happens. He says, well, what do you want to write about? I said, I'm really interested in Theodore Roosevelt in 1896. How does he go from being at the top of the world in 1895 and then backs the wrong guy for president, hates the job that he's got that resurrected his political career, police commissioner of New York, doesn't like McKinley, McKinley doesn't like him, but somehow or another, he ends up in McKinley's sub-cabinet. How does this all happen? Unbeknownst to me, Lewis L. Gould is one of the great historians of the Gilded Age, and he said, I'll take you on. First time he'd ever taken anybody on. And he said, but you have to read the McKinley papers because history gets McKinley and the election of 1896 wrong. And the more I dealt with the McKinley papers, which are disorganized, they're on microfilm at UT, they're held at the Library of Congress, completely disorganized, but the more I tried to make sense of them, the more I became convinced he was absolutely right. History gets McKinley wrong and the election of 1896 wrong, starting with the belief that McKinley is run by, that he's the pawn of Marcus Alonzo Hanna, a wealthy businessman, iron smelter and coal magnate from Cleveland, and that he is the brains behind the McKinley campaign. Turns out not to be true. It turns out very much to be the opposite. Think of him as Don Evans to George W. Bush. Think of him as the candidate's great friend who wants to help elect him, but he doesn't have good political judgment. The actual guy who manages the campaign in the general election, I traced his travel. Of the 112 days of the general election in 1896, Mark Hanna is out of Chicago, which is where the headquarters is, and on the road for 70 days. Now, this is before cell phones and the internet and email and faxes and video conferences, so there's no way he's running the campaign. The campaign is actually run by a young man whom I stumbled across in the McKinley papers in a letter regarding the victory at the Illinois Republican Convention, which ends the Republican battle for the nomination. The kid is 30 years old, and I stumble across him in a brief letter written by McKinley the night that he wins the Illinois Convention. In his beautiful handwriting, he writes this note, and put yourself in my place. I'm reading this note for the first time, and wouldn't you be interested in finding out more about this young man? I cannot close the day without sending you a message of appreciation and congratulations. There is nothing in all of this long campaign so signal and significant as the triumph at Springfield. I cannot find words to express my admiration for your high qualities of leadership. You have won exceptional honor. You had long ago won my heart. This kid is 30 years old. McKinley meets him 2 years previously. He's 28. Kid from Ohio who got his law degree in Cincinnati and struck out for the West to make his living. make his fortune as a country lawyer living in Lincoln, Nebraska. He meets McKinley. He practices law there in a small office building in Lincoln with another young lawyer who's 5 years his senior, William Jennings Bryan. And the two men often have lunch at Cameron's, a 15-cent diner, with another young pal of theirs, the ROTC instructor at the University of Nebraska, a West Pointer named John J. Pershing. He meets McKinley in 1894, travels to Columbus and says, "You're a reform-minded Republican who wants to modernize and change our party, and I'm for you. And if you want, I'll help you organize Nebraska." Tall kid, red hair, parted right in the middle, looks sort of goofy, smart as hell. And McKinley senses something in this kid and sees him again that October when he's barnstorming in the midterm elections and goes to Nebraska. And the kid says, "I got Nebraska organized for you, and I'm working on Wyoming and the Dakotas, and here's some people that you ought to be in touch with because they're for you." And McKinley, the kid moves to Chicago in January of 1895 to become an entrepreneur. He's decided he's going to take a little bit of money that he's made in some banking deals and real estate in Lincoln and plunge them into buying gas utilities. He says, if I buy these little gas utilities that serve a couple of blocks and knit them together, I'm going to be able to get economies of scale and make a lot of money. And he proceeds to do this. So what does McKinley do? He says, "You're the charge of my campaign in the most important primary contest in the country. I want you to take on the blonde boss, William J. Larimer, and beat the Chicago Republican machine at their state convention." And the kid does it. He's 30 years old. He has 3 guys working for him. One's another young guy who's a streetcar conductor, and 2 of them are Civil War generals, 30 years his senior. And they come to admire this kid so much, they start calling him the general, because he's so meticulous and well organized. Has a little card file where he keeps track of every delegate in every county convention in all 99 counties in Illinois, and at the convention deals a blow, a surprise deadly blow to the Combine men, defeats them, and causes McKinley to write that letter. This kid goes to Washington with McKinley, and at the age of 32 is put in charge of the nation's financial system as the comptroller of the currency. He later goes on to become a successful Chicago businessman and lawyer, first director of the very first Bureau of the Budget under Warren G. Harding, vice president under Calvin Coolidge, ambassador to Great Britain, first head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and the 4th American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But when McKinley meets him, he's a 28-year-old lawyer in Lincoln, Nebraska, and McKinley says, "This kid has talent." This is one of the great abilities of McKinley. And you ask a question, Fritz, we sort of took away to get around to the final answer, but this, the more I read of McKinley, the more I stumbled across incidents like this of a political adeptness and a talent that we rarely see in our political leaders. Question over here, back here. And then hand it to the woman behind you.
They say Kearns Goodwin is the best presidential historian of our time, but I think you could give her a run for her money with this. I'm really curious about the patronage system, but that sounds like a really long topic to go over just in one sitting. So I guess I'll ask you, I know a lot of the more antiquity presidents don't have their own presidential museums. Does William McKinley have his own presidential museum?
Yeah, he does. He has a presidential library in Canton, Ohio, and if you ever get close to it, go. Because the library's not much to look at. But his mausoleum is. He was assassinated in September of 1901 by a terrorist. If you want to see, look at the front pages in the newspapers. I'm going to have an article appear in an Ohio history magazine on this. I originally anticipated opening the book with the story of his assassination, but he's killed by a terrorist. And the front page, and he's expected to recover. He's shot twice, and he's expected to recover. And when he dies, the nation deeply grieves. The front pages of the newspapers show cartoons of an angry Uncle Sam grabbing an anarchist and throttling him, or Uncle Sam gloating over a terrorist being hung from the gibbet. I mean, this is a moment that between Lincoln and Kennedy, this is the moment of national grieving. And he is now laid to rest in a beautiful black marble sarcophagus inside a tower on a hill outside of Canton. And the sarcophagus was made with contributions from school children of America.
Isn't that where the term ignorance is bliss came from?
I don't know. I don't know.
Dr. Bliss could have saved him with the X-ray.
Well, no, I think that, I'm not familiar with that. He's operated upon, the city's leading surgeon in Buffalo is out on vacation, so the guy who operates on him is a gynecologist. And today he could have easily survived his wounds. But back then, without antibiotics, he dies a terrible death of a gangrene. It literally rots inside and dies. And the nation goes into a huge mourning. 500,000 people line the railroad tracks between Buffalo and Washington, D.C. 30 or 40,000 people cram into the station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where the train has to replenish its water supply. And there's so many people packed in the station, the governor of Pennsylvania cannot push his way through the crowd to pay his respects to McKinley and McKinley's widow. And when the train begins to pull out of the station, the crowd spontaneously begins singing, "God Bless America." The train comes steaming into the Baltimore station through hundreds of yards of flowers that have been strewn on the tracks. So when the locomotive finally arrives in the station, it's literally covered with flower petals. When a darkness sets as the train pulls out of Baltimore, and a reporter is deeply moved as they make their way to Washington, because all along the tracks, every several hundred yards, as a bonfire has been lit by farmers, most of them poor blacks, who are standing there with their hats off, marking the last ride of their fallen chief. And when the funeral ends in Canton, Ohio, and he's conveyed to the Wirt Receiving Vault in the Canton Cemetery, 16,000 people parade behind his coffin, led by the military and Civil War veterans. And the school children of Nashville, Tennessee have arranged to send train car loads of sweet pea flowers to be strewn on the path. So you have the scene of grizzled Civil War veterans weeping, stopping to pick up flowers to put in their lapels to honor their chief. The entire cabinet is there, many of them openly weeping. Theodore Roosevelt, the new president, holds himself, he's standing apart from the cabinet because he's so concerned that he will lose control of himself if he sits with his comrades, that he has to stand aside. And behind the receiving vault is a ridge line about 50 feet tall, 500 yards long, and it is filled, I have pictures of it, it's extraordinary, filled with floral tributes. Some of them are from like the Tsar of Russia and the President of Argentina, but most of them are sent by working people, bearing the tin men of New Philadelphia, of East Liverpool, Ohio, salute their chief. The collieries of Lackawanna County, the men of the collieries of Lackawanna County, mourn his passing. And it's an amazing outpouring from working class people who'd seen in McKinley the man who brought prosperity to the country. Back in the back.
Going back to present day politics, what do you think is going to
Do we
happen?
have to?
What do you think is going to happen with the National Convention this summer? And precisely, what do you think Ted Cruz should do as a strategy to make sure that he gets enough delegates to beat Trump?
Work like hell. Look, I think we're back to 1976. That's the last convention Republicans had, where we showed up at the convention in Kansas City. I was in the number 2 guy at the Republican Party of Virginia, which sounds really cool, but there are only 3 of us. And frankly, the secretary did rank slightly higher than me. But we arrived in Kansas City, and there was nobody with a clear majority. Ford was in front, Reagan was behind him, but there were enough uncommitted delegates, principally in Mississippi and Pennsylvania, that it was unclear who the nominee was going to be. We may be back at 1948, which is the last time that we had a convention where we went more than one ballot. We may be back at 1940, which is the last time we had a convention where somebody who was not leading was nominated. Number 1 was on the ballot. First ballot was Thomas Dewey, the anti-organized crime crusading district attorney of Manhattan. Behind him was Robert A. Taft, the young isolationist senator from Ohio, and in a distant third was Wendell Willkie, a utility company executive from Indiana originally. A Democrat in January. By June, he's a contender for the Republican nomination. After the third ballot, the young governor of Minnesota, Harold Stassen, and Alf Landon, the former governor of Kansas, meet in a freight elevator Both of them decide that they need to support Wilkie, throw their support to him, and on the sixth ballot, he's the nominee. And, you know, we may be back there, I don't know. I do know that let's watch Wisconsin. If Cruz comes out of Wisconsin next week, the victor, winning 15 statewide delegates and carrying most of the congressional districts, then we will definitely have a convention where somebody is unlikely to be on the edge of 12,037, the majority needed. And the question is, how far off will they be? Right now, Trump is 94 delegates behind the total of his combined opposition. But it's harder to keep together that combined opposition to him, particularly if we get down to a difference of, you know, Donald Trump is 25 or 30 delegates. But if he's 100 or 125, Hal Crocker's more up to date on this than I am and could probably tell you. But my sense is if he's more than 100 delegates or 125 delegates below the number, then we are likely to see several ballots and somebody could emerge. We could be back in 1980, or excuse me, 1880. Or if you want to look at the Democrats, back to 1952. Those are the last two conventions in which somebody was nominated who was not a candidate for the nomination. 1952, the two front runners were Estes Kefauver of Tennessee and Alvin Barkley of Kentucky. And President Harry S. Truman said, we don't want to have a Southern segregationist leading the Democratic ticket. So on the eve of the convention, he convinces Adlai Stevenson Jr., who has never competed in a primary, to allow his name to be tossed into the hat, and he's nominated by the Democrats. In 1880, we have 1,000 delegates to the National Convention. On the first ballot, Ulysses S. Grant, who served 2 terms as president, hung out for 4 years, and is now attempting to return to power, has 303 delegates. And for the next 34 ballots, he gets between 303 and 313 delegates, but he can't get above it and can't get close to the 500 needed. So on the 34th ballot, people say, well, you know what? That young congressman from Ohio, it's a battleground state. He gave a pretty darn good speech when he nominated his state's former senior senator, now Treasury Secretary John Sherman. He's the ranking Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, smart as heck when it comes to economic issues. Maybe we ought to have that guy as our nominee. And James A. Garfield takes to the floor to say, no man can vote for me without my permission. They say, forget you. And 2 ballots later, naming the Republican nominee. We've had 6 nominees of the Republican Party who did not lead on the first ballot, and 5 of them, starting with Abraham Lincoln, went on to win the presidency. So I don't know where we are, but it's going to be one hell of a convention. Watch for me on Fox. I'll be sitting there with Chris Wallace pontificating. One last question, then we're out of here. And make it a good one. Yes, sir.
1990, Democratic sweep almost across the state of Texas, but Rick Perry got elected. How did you help make that happen?
Well, actually, a funny story. When I came to Austin, they hunted Republicans with dogs in this town. And I was about the only consultant in town. And in 1988, George Christian, who had been Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, was working on a constitutional amendment on behalf of the highway contractors. And he told the head of the highway contractors, Tom Johnson, who's still the head of the highway contractors. Tom Johnson's been the head of the highway contractors for 45 years. He told Tom, he said, this ought to be a bipartisan effort. There's one young guy in town, a Republican consultant. I think we ought to get him involved in the campaign. And so that's how I've got to work with and become a great friend of George Christian's. And at the end of the campaign, he took me to lunch at the Headliners, which was a big deal back then. Not so big now that I'm a member. They've let anybody in. But he said, he took me to lunch. He said, there's a young Democratic filmmaker, media guy, who is a conservative, and he doesn't understand that the life of the conservatives and the Democratic Party is over. And he said, if I were a young man, I'd switch parties, but I'm not. I'm not a young man, so I'm not switching parties. But you and I need to convince David Weeks to switch parties, and you need to help get him some business. So I was working with a former legislator whom I'd met when I worked for Fred Agnich, who had lost a couple of races and was thinking about running for state treasurer, a young lawyer from Dallas named Kay Bailey Hutchison. And so I lined up, I sat down with Weeks, and together George Christian and I convinced him to switch parties, and I lined him up to work for Kay Bailey Hutchison. And Weeks says, you know, I got a buddy of mine. He's a legislator. You know him pretty well. He's from West Texas, Rick Perry. He's a friend of Bill Clements, conservative Democrat, and he's can't make enough money in the legislature. He's going to leave the legislature and become a lobbyist. but why don't we convince him to run against the leader of the Democratic ticket in 1986, Jim Hightower, and because if he loses, then every conservative business guy in Texas will know he's a strong, committed conservative, and if he wins, he'll resurrect his political career. So we went and talked Rick Perry into switching parties and taking on the hapless task of running against the guy who had led the ticket, the Democratic ticket in 1986, Jim Hightower. And of course, the rest is history. We were helped by the fact that, as our TV ad said, he's under FBI investigation, and had a lot of fun with it. But the two victories that year, the down ballot victories, and we never had down ballot victories before, were Rick Perry and for Agriculture Commissioner, and right above him on the ballot, Kay Bailey Hutchison for Treasurer. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. Let me say one more thing. If you get the book, Gersendorf, come up here. Come on up, be compliant. So if you read the book, chapter 18, opening page, it's the first day of the Republican convention. I was reading all these fun newspaper reports, and like the South Carolina delegation, which is poor and black, are literally selling whiskey sours on the street corners of St. Louis in order to make enough money to pay their hotel bill. And peddlers are selling things. They're selling badges. This is the first election in which there were widespread use of political badges. They're selling canes. I have one. It has this tin blob. The Tin Men, the tin protectionists are fans of McKinley, so they're selling canes with a tin blob that's supposed to look like McKinley. And I read in there that they're also selling handkerchiefs, blue handkerchiefs with white stars with a stern visage of McKinley. And this caught my eye because later on, Mrs. McKinley is sitting there in Canton, Ohio, and they're getting telegrams telling them of stuff on the floor of the convention. And she laughs when she is told that there's a particular wire report that comes across that Congressman Grosvenor of Ohio has taken his McKinley handkerchief and has been seen mopping the head of Marcus Alonzo Hanna, who's bald, but he's apparently sweating profusely in the unair-conditioned St. Louis auditorium, and she loves the fact that this handkerchief is being used. So I put this in the book, and then about 3 weeks after the book is published, a guy writes me and says, I understand you're working on McKinley. I have this for sale. Would you like it? And so I bought it and made copies of the McKinley handkerchief on the opening page of chapter 18 of the McKinley book. So to mop your brow, there's your McKinley handkerchief. Thanks for having me.
Isn't he a great storyteller? We were having lunch one day last year when he was writing this book in the Opera House, otherwise known as the Austin Club, and he started telling me some of these stories about his research on this book. It's phenomenal. So thank you again, Karl, for being here today and sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us. Karl's going to be doing some book signing. He signed some books earlier, pre-signed some books earlier, but also going to do some additional personalized signings, if you will, out front. And I want to make one other comment, and we'll be adjourned. I just want to tell you that TPPF has a few more sessions coming up in the near future. On April the 7th, we've got a function, the civil asset forfeiture issue will be discussed, and that's co-hosted with the Charles Koch Foundation. And is that going to be, Clint, is that going to be here up on 6th floor? Here, it'll be here in the same room. On April the 12th, we'll be having a session on school finance, which may be sort of timely. We're expecting a ruling from the Texas Supreme Court any day. So, you know, whether or not a ruling will be forthcoming before the 12th or not, we'll never know until then. But we're going to have a good discussion on school finance and talk about a new paper we're issuing on school finance. And as Karl knows, we've been fighting this issue for decades. It's time for us to finally find a solution instead of continuing to knock the ball down the road. And on April 28th, we'll have a talk about ride sharing. I guess they're talking about Uber and that sort of thing. So on April 28th, a debate on ride sharing regulations in Austin, and I assume that'll also be in the theater here. So thank you again for being here today. Again, let's give one last round of applause. Karl, thanks for your help. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, man.